Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. All right, folks, Big Paul here today with another Muscle Science episode with Kurt Havens. What's going on, Kurt?
What's going on?
Well, people really liked the first episode about trends, so I figured we better talk some more about other PEDs.
Cool. We'll do how it's some human growth hormone.
Yeah, we'll do human growth hormone today, man. But I had a lot of people DM me. They loved the Trenbolone talk, and so they learned some stuff that they hadn't heard before. So that was very insightful. So we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of growth hormone, which has come to be one of my favorite substances to use. I mean, you know, from talking to me, but I've been pushing doses up and playing around with growth hormone a lot more. And I wish I'd used it a long time ago.
Yeah.
Honestly.
One of the more groundbreaking things out
there. Yeah.
And
it seems to be one of the safer compounds that we have in our arsenal as bodybuilders to use too. So that was always sort of a fear. It's funny though, like when I talk to people, you know, recreational bodybuilders or bodybuilders, the two things that they always seem to fear more than anything are insulin and growth hormone.
Yeah.
It's funny that people are afraid of growth hormone, but they'll run copious amounts of Trenbolone and Anadrol and
Anadrol, D-ball.
Yeah, all these other toxic compounds, and then they're scared of growth hormone.
Misinformation.
So let's hope to set some of that straight today. Let's talk about the history of growth hormone.
It was discovered a long time ago, over 100 years ago, and it was really isolated in the 1940s. They didn't really understand what it was. They originally called it a sulfation factor, which isn't fully incorrect. Basically, what they were speculating was that growth hormone itself didn't actually do the action that other hormones downstream did. So they weren't fully wrong. As we'll get into, it seems that most of the effects are actually mediated by insulin growth factor 1 and not from growth hormone directly, right? We'll split it up. We'll go over what growth hormone kind of does, and then we can get on what insulin growth factor 1 does as well. But I'm not going to get into insulin plus growth hormone because I feel like that probably warrants a whole separate video.
Yeah, that could be a video on its own.
Okay. And my ebook should be done in about a week. What we're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's another thing too, folks. We're going to have an ebook up for sale on growth hormone that will be a deep dive into growth hormone. I'm sure it'll be up on Kurt's site and it'll be on my site as well too. If you want to pick it up, I would suggest checking it out. I actually just read through your draft of it last night. It was very good.
Thanks. Yeah, it's long. It's 60-something pages, I think, and it has 100 studies cited in it.
It was the most comprehensive thing I've read on growth hormone. How does it work?
How does growth hormone work? So you want to talk about endogenous, or we can briefly, when we do endogenous, just briefly. It's a stress hormone, right? So it's considered a stress hormone, except it's the only stress hormone that technically is anabolic, right? Where cortisol would be the opposite effect of that. So it's typically released in states of starvation, hunger, extreme stress during sleep, times when insulin is low, right? Insulin would be an antagonist to it. And so, but we're only going to focus on exogenous, right?
Okay.
Where we use it for performance. So the effects are, obviously a little different when it's used exogenously. Where do you want to start with that?
Let's talk about hyperplasia versus hypertrophy mechanism of growth hormone.
Okay. Well, I could probably start by saying too that so growth hormone is very anabolic, right? But it doesn't actually cause skeletal muscle growth itself directly. It's probably going to ruffle some feathers. But growth hormone itself is anabolic, but it doesn't cause muscle growth on its own.
Yeah, that's what I understood.
So anabolism simply is just basically the building up of tissue. It doesn't necessarily mean muscle growth, right? It means the buildup of anything. So technically, red blood cells, the buildup of that, like Henry Poetic effects, from the EPO is technically anabolic, right? Because you're building up tissue versus catabolism or catabolic, something is the breaking down, right? So growth hormone is causing anabolism. Most of the studies show that it causes nitrogen retention and it's causing a buildup of tissue like intercellular matrix, things like collagen, but it's not really doing anything direct itself on actual, hypertrophy. So hypertrophy would be defined as basically an existing cell getting larger, right? You do bicep curls and your biceps grow. Hyperplasia is basically the splitting of cells, right? The fusion of a new nuclei, and a spill will actually split, which mostly only occurs in the womb, right? And that's controlled by genetics. So the amount of muscle cells that you're born with is pretty much fixed before birth. It's speculated, though, that growth hormone in the large enough dose will cause hyperplasia to occur in adults. And that's kind of where probably the bodybuilding community gets much use out of it, is from that effect more so than hyperplasia.
I would think, I've always speculated the increased collagen production also is beneficial too for us for things like connective tissue, skin, etc. I've definitely noticed an improvement in my skin and my fingernail. One thing I noticed, like when I crank my HGH doses up, I have to cut my fingernails like 2-3 times a week.
Thick, right?
Yeah, they're thick, and I have to cut them more frequently. So it definitely changed that. Same thing with my toenails. But I don't know. It seems to have an effect on skin too. I don't know if there's any information or studies on that or not, but I've noticed like my skin tone is way better.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be through collagen. So I cited in my book some of those effects, right? And so as far as going back to like natural production, endogenous growth hormone, those effects are generally mediated by estrogen, because that's going to have the biggest effect on that pathway. It's not so much the case when you inject growth hormone.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm totally talking from my bro science knowledge here, but doesn't estrogen also have an impact on the conversion of IGF-1 as well?
It does, as far as, again, endogenous, because it's going to stimulate that pathway. So they've done things with using an anti-estrogen that'll impact so if you ran, I mean, if you were using testosterone and use an AI, you're probably not going to get the same IGF effect from it as you would without, if your estrogen is slightly elevated. When you inject either IGF or growth hormone, even if you were to use an AI, it's not going to have the same impact. The dose is so high that you're kind of counteracting that effect.
Okay.
At least that's where the current stuff that I've seen is.
So, I mean, natural production of growth hormone, how and when does that happen? We talked about, you talked about the pulsatile.
Yeah, so it's pulsatile in nature. Several times a day, men and women. So we're specifically talking about men, right? It's the effects of men and women are very different, both endogenous and exogenous use. And I'm not going to get into the female side, because that gets a little more complicated. It's pulsatile in nature several times a day, especially upon, a couple hours after falling asleep is the largest secretion. It's about 0.4 to 0.5 milligrams daily total over all the pulses that's secreted, right? So if you compare that to how many milligrams you would get when you would typically inject, right? So, Serostim is, you use a whole bottle of Serostim, you're injecting 6 milligrams.
Yeah, so it's like 2 units, right?
Yeah. So a replacement dose would be, we'll use like the 100 kilogram person, because that's the standard scientific model. So that's a 220 pound person. Replacement dose is like 1.2 to 1.5 units would replace biological amounts. And that's, after you subtract, it's similar to an ester. So you would say you absorb about 80% of injected growth hormone.
Yeah, and I would assume that endogenous production declines as you get older too.
After 30, it's down about 10% a decade. So
yeah, I've definitely noticed too, like with secretagogues, it seems like guys that are older don't respond as well to secretagogues as younger guys too.
There's probably some other factors too. So testosterone also is going to impact that as well. Same with, obviously, with regular growth hormone as well. So if someone is older and their testosterone be on the low normal side, they're probably not going to get as much from the secretagogue as they would if their testosterone was slightly higher, or if you were using TRT or whatever with it, right? I know my father's in his 70s and he's been using MK677 for a couple months now.
Mm-hmm.
And he's seeing actually really great differences from
it. Oh, good.
It actually fixed like some of he had a little bit of arthritis in his knuckles and stuff, and it fixed some of that. And he's sleeping a lot better. But I haven't seen his labs in a long time, but I believe his testosterone was at least in the normal range. So there's probably more of an effect there.
Clearly, whatever Sylvester Stallone is doing at 76 or 77 is working.
Right.
Yeah, and I know he got busted with it in the airport one time. He had, I think it was in Australia. They detained him because he had growth hormone in his bag. In your notes here, you had that, and I was looking at the GH supplementation has never directly resulted in the strength gains in any trials. Let's talk about that.
Well, because the mechanisms that would cause strength, right? It's not really going to impact any of those things. A lot of those are neurological, right? Or leverage, or things you're born with, like pennation angle, and then some of the lack of hypertrophy effects, right? It does cause, growth hormone causes some water retention and some sodium retention, but that's not enough to cause, a direct strength thing, right? You probably never notice any strength gain from that per se, right? It'd be more like a DHT or 19-NOR perhaps, that's going to mediate that stuff. Because I don't think the brain effects of growth hormone are not, they're probably like the opposite effect. They're getting amped up, right? That's very calming.
It just makes me sleepy.
Yeah.
I want to take a nap.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the growth hormone receptor.
Okay, so just like other steroid hormones, growth hormone would be a peptide hormone, but other steroid hormones, there is a receptor for it that it has to bind to in order to cause gene transcription, and it's also bound. Growth hormone is both free in the blood and it is also bound as well. So it comes in two basic dimmers, 22 and 20. 90% is bound, and that's 22 K dimmer. It is, if you were to do a constant infusion of growth hormone, like intravenous, you would only get a response initially, and then the response would taper off because the cell needs a period of time, like a refractory period between doses to mimic the pulsatile nature of it. And in that space where it's dormant, you have something called JAK2, basically, which is a gene that basically binds to the receptor and keeps it from going to the cell surface. So there are certain things that can obviously speed that up. Using insulin actually will help that process speed up, but the standard is 6 to 8 hours for most people, where the receptor will go back to the cell surface. And
with dosing too, so considering that, so would it make sense to dose it multiple times a day?
So this is where it gets a little tricky. That and timing are the two. I think the most misunderstood things about growth hormone are the dosing and the frequency of the timing of it, right? So in HIV patients, Serostim is pretty much used all the time. And for anyone over 140 pounds, the whole bottle is given, which is 6 milligrams, which for you or I mix normally would be about 18 units, right? So like if a bodybuilder is going to use Serostim and he's going to dilute it, it would be 18 units of growth. And a lot of them inject it all at once, right? You and I know people that have used that amount. Now, that's working in HIV. That doesn't mean that that's the best method for bodybuilders.
Right.
Some of that is compliancy, right? So patients aren't going to inject things multiple times a day. Most patients won't inject things daily. So a lot of these guidelines were created just to get the drug in them. And a dose like that too is for HIV, it's administered before bed. And part of it, like you said before, it makes you fall asleep. So it kind of helps ease them to a deeper sleep. For normal use, you really don't want to go above 3 units per injection. Really much above that, there's kind of a cap that's again set by the nature of it intrinsically, that your body doesn't really know what to do with this big bolus of it. So if you were to inject 6 or 8 units or 10 units at once, it's not to say that it would get wasted, but the studies kind of show that the excess isn't doing anything at that point. You'd be better off, 3 units, like spacing it out every 6 or 8 hours. Or if you're using insulin, you could probably get by every 4 hours, let's say. That seems to be the more effective way to use it. I know you have a friend, I think, that used all 18. They used it all at once before.
Yeah, that was Chase.
And he still got a result out of it. So it's not to say it doesn't work, right? Clearly it works.
But I was shocked that the dose for HIV patients is 18 units. Why is it so high?
So some of it is actually so they have a whole series of genes that are being expressed that you and I don't have, or we have them, they're just not expressed. Like there's a series of genes called forkhead box. They go by like FOXO and then a number. Those genes they cause rapid muscle loss. So they're experiencing, similar to a burn victim, they're experiencing a distorted metabolism and their muscles falling off their body very quickly. Versus if you or I laid in a bed, you're not really going to lose weight. They'll lose weight exponentially. So what that does, but when you administer such a huge bolus, is it causes the blood sugar to go really high. So kind of the opposite effect that you and I would want. You and I would administer insulin, right, to control that. For them, the super high blood sugar actually brings their cortisol level down. So it'll stop some of that gene expression. So again, it's not necessary that the dose used for those people is the dose that people shouldn't be using that kind of dose, I don't think. I mean, it's okay. For a guy like Chase, it's fine to play with that. But I don't think for the average person watching this video, they probably should not be using 18 units of growth hormone.
Well, I don't think most people could afford 18
Or,
units.
the price is about what, without insurance. What was it, $7,000 a box or something? It's 20 grand a month.
Yeah, it was 20 grand a month for
20 grand a month for 4 boxes without insurance. So it's
yeah,
240,000 a year is a lot of money to spend on drugs.
Yeah, that's a lot of money to spend on growth hormone. That's why I laugh when people think that all these pros are running huge doses of growth hormone. I'm like, most of these guys are broke.
Yeah, I mean, they're not getting it at CVS either, but they're not, still even at
I mean, even if you ran generics that were cheap, I mean, it's pricey. Yeah, I mean, if you ran 17 units, generics you can get for, I don't know.
Yeah, but with most generics are what, like 10 units per bottle?
Yeah, usually 10.
You're using almost 2 bottles a day.
Yeah.
You'd be going through a kit every 5 days, give or take. Right there, 10 bottles in black whatever.
$200-300.
It'd be a lot of money to be spending on growth hormone.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of these guys are running that. And I've noticed, like with me, like I've messed around with higher doses, but it seems like anything more than, I'm at 9.5 now. It's split up into 3 doses, and it seems like anything more than that, I don't find any additional benefit. I just get more side effects.
Yeah, I want to say my threshold was 8 or 9. At 9, my arms were numb from my shoulders all the way down, where I could smack them into a wall. Like, you wake up at night and you actually can't feel your limbs. So another one, I don't know, we might be going out of order here, but where I think that people get confused too is on the timing, right? People are very obsessed about being fasted when given growth hormone.
I always wondered about that too.
So I'm not saying it's not 100% correct, and I'm not saying it doesn't do something. I think there's a couple things that are missed though. So when you inject sub-Q growth hormone, which is how most people would administer it, it takes 2 to 3 hours before it's fully absorbed. So even if you woke up in the morning and you injected it and you went in and did your fasted cardio, it doesn't mean that there's an extra amount of fatty acids floating around your blood that weren't already floating around, because the growth hormone's not even absorbed yet. And then fasted cardio on its own is not really even proven to do. This is going to ruffle other feathers. There's really no difference between that and fasted cardio per se. So people do whatever cardio they want, but using the growth hormone there might not be, it's not necessarily advantageous. I would say, do it in between meals, just in like the post-absorptive state, just your insulin's not at its peak, but I wouldn't be so concerned. And even drugs like, and Serostim, again, for example, actually has sucrose in the bottle. So
yeah, I noticed that on the ingredients.
On an empty stomach, because you're worried about insulin levels, you've now raised your insulin levels anyway. So, because again, it's not a concern.
Plus, when has a bodybuilder ever fasted anyway?
No. And the funny thing is, if you read the instructions, if you get any pharmaceutical grade growth hormone and you read the instructions that come with it, that I've ever seen, it doesn't say anywhere that it needs to be done, fasted. Right? HGH is given before bed. It doesn't say don't eat for 3 hours. It just says before bed, inject 1 vial.
Yeah, I read through the whole instruction packets and
it comes with that really cool, like with the studies and stuff in it.
Yeah, it has some really neat study in the Serostim packets.
Right, and they're very clear in it to also state that the most of the effects are through IGF-1.
Yes, they're very clear. So why wouldn't you just take IG? Well, I don't know. Real IGF-1 is hard to find, but
to me, again, not necessarily 100% correct, but I mean, my understanding is Increlux is the most effective IGF-1 brand. Yeah. I believe that's really hard to find. I don't know. I've never, outside of like clinical stuff, I've never even seen it. It's not like a black market drug that I know of.
And from what I understand, the guys in Europe bodybuilders in Europe seem to have access to it, but from what I understand, it's even more expensive than growth hormone is.
And I've seen it here. Obviously, like I said, I've just never seen a black market. It's it's used for children with obviously a dysfunction in IGF.
Yep.
But I think you're also missing some of the effects. So there were some really cool studies to show that actually if you inject growth hormone directly, if you spot inject growth hormone, it'll cause a higher rise in autocrine. I can explain that in a second. IGF than injecting IGF into the same muscle. So I would, again, not necessarily 100% correct, but I would say HGH is probably more effective at raising IGF than IGF itself.
Huh, interesting.
At least in autocrine. So you have exocrine. So when most people get labs done to see their IGF level, you're looking at exocrine levels, which are basically what is floating around, right? But what matters the most is the autocrine, the amount that's actually in the muscle, which is harder to measure.
I've always wondered about the direct injections, because the logical part of me, like, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, would it really make any difference? Because I thought IGF-1 was produced in the liver anyway.
it's mainly, so like, let's say 90% is produced in the liver. Some is produced autocrine as well, right? So
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Testosterone, other anabolic steroids can also cause autocrine production. Trenbolone, nandrolone is really good at that as well. Will produce autocrine in the muscle IGF production. Your brain can actually produce IGF-1 as well through glial cells. I sent you that study.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that.
The plasticity stuff is really cool. Even, you know, and even growth hormone itself can be secreted from other things. Even your teeth actually secrete growth hormone on their own.
Interesting.
Growth hormone just affected your teeth actually can generate some level of growth hormone on their own as well.
And I know this is sort of off our script of what we were talking about, but I know there's a lot of people in the anti-aging community that use growth hormone as well. I mean, is it really worthwhile for anti-aging, or?
A lot of doctors would probably say no, because they would be worried about adverse effects, right? I mean, that's kind of same with steroids, right? That's been beaten down our throats, you know, all this stuff. I would say if it's used in a moderate way, you know, 2 units a day, give or take, you know, for a man, and you're getting labbed and it's done in a safe way, monitored by a doctor. I don't know why it wouldn't benefit you, right? I mean, like you said, look at Sylvester Stallone.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely does something. It definitely has an effect there. I think, and even if it's not only through sleep, but even if it were only because of the improved sleep from it, that would have a tremendous effect just on your aging to begin with, right?
I have noticed that people that use it seem to not age, like, at least cosmetically, they don't seem to age the same way that other people do. Yeah, I mean, I'm 50 years old, dude. Look at me. I don't have wrinkles.
Yeah, I'm 40. I'm right behind you. I'm 47. So I think, I just think there's a great effect that, you know, a cosmetic effect from it, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think it has. I don't think the FDA is really into us using it as an anti-aging drug, right? That's considered off-label and not,
right.
Certain states not even legal.
I just look at other people my age and they look awful.
Yeah, I mean, that's you're also not eating the same junk they're eating. You're not drinking the
True.
food.
I mean, it's multifactorial.
Yeah, totally. But like, the growth hormone has a huge impact on the way you look, right? And your body fat levels as well.
I mean, being leaner helps, but having a cleaner diet, working out, all that. But I definitely have noticed a difference.
The one effect that growth hormone does seem to have directly on muscle growth that's being explored, it's relatively new, is it affects a protein called decorin. Decorin is a cytokine, and more specifically a myokine, and growth hormone actually seems to impact levels of that. And so that directly interacts with mTOR. So will cause some protein synthesis. So when I said before that it's never been directly linked to muscle growth, but it's definitely doing something there in that whole series of events. And if people are wondering what myokine or cytokine is, so cytokine is basically, you know, like an immune response to stress or to damage. They discovered myokines are a specific type of cytokine in the early 80s. And during COVID, they didn't know what to do with it in the 80s. So they shelved the information, as this happens all the time. And they went back and they realized that it wasn't called myokine until very recently. They went back and they found the specific cytokine, and they realized that it was one of the mechanisms of muscle growth. So that there's just like a new discovery, right? And so this plays into IGF and all these things, right? Because one of the IGF variants is called mechano growth factor, and that's actually the missing link. That's the signal that causes muscles to grow.
Oh, wow.
So that comes directly from IGF.
Mechano growth factor, right?
Yeah, it's like an offshoot of.
And how does that work?
Mechano growth factor?
Yes.
To make it really simple, is your muscles sense tension, and when they sense tension, they release mechano growth factor, and that is what kicks off the whole process of muscle growth.
So it's an adaptive process.
It's chemical. Yeah, it's not. So, and this is one of the reasons why things like the pump doesn't necessarily contribute directly to growth, right? Like that swelling is not necessarily going to do anything. We've injected lactate directly into muscles, and they don't ever grow from that, and that's mimicking the pump, right? It's not to say the pump couldn't cause something, but it's just not directly related. Versus mechano growth factor is kind of the actual signal that's causing it.
Interesting.
It'd be like if you lifted the same weight, you know, all the time, like your body's not going to get enough of a mechanical tension response to actually activate this anymore.
All right. So progressing your weights is a thing.
Yeah, that's a real thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about the thyroid part of growth hormone, how it affects thyroid.
Okay. Well, as like for my post the other day with the T4 and the T3.
Yes.
So again, I'll try to keep that simple because there's more in the book, and that could be like a whole nother video on itself. Basically, what you're looking at is you run at a substrate. You basically run at a T4. It's not really affecting the T3 so much, or it's raising that, but it's not. It's the enzymes between the two, the conversion, that's going to dictate how well growth hormone will work. And as you run out of the substrate T4, you obviously don't have the enzymatic conversion there, and that's going to dictate. And I'll speculate. You and I have talked about this before, I believe. You notice the leaner someone is, or the more muscular they are and leaner, the better they respond to growth hormone, right?
Yes.
Like I've seen in like wellness clinics, when you give a big fat guy growth hormone, he might get a little bit out of it, but he doesn't get a ton out of it. Versus like, I would be considered a fast responder to it, right? You as well.
Yeah, I know. Man, I noticed when I upped my doses that I just like rapidly started getting leaner without changing my diet.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to say that there's something that's connected to that whole thyroid thing, right?
I not only did I get leaner, I had a fuller look too. Like I just saw Justin this weekend, and Justin hadn't seen me in a couple months.
You just look bigger.
And he was like, holy crap. He's like, you lost weight and got bigger at the same time. He's like, I didn't see it in your pictures, but seeing you in person.
I kind of noticed that too. So the scale, right, when you first start, the scale goes up immediately, right? There's some water retention immediately. And then I feel like that physical weight actually drops off at some point, whether it's at a month or 2 months or whatever, probably depending on the dose. That water retention is dose dependent. And I feel like the fat loss continues in the muscle growth, assuming that someone is using it with something else, right?
Right. An anabolic.
With an anabolic, even testosterone, I would say there's like a body comp change, right? Where you seem to keep growing, but yet your scale weight doesn't necessarily move.
Right.
Right. So you can weigh the same as you did 3 months ago, but you look entirely different.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. I've noticed like with competitors too that people that use growth hormone just have a different look. They just have a completely different
like 3D, right?
Yeah, the 3D look, the round look, the hard, it's just a different look.
And an insulin would obviously magnify that as well, right?
Yeah, and you can look back through bodybuilding, like you can look through the history of bodybuilding pictures. It's interesting. You can go back and see when people started using growth hormone and insulin, but they had this big round look that they didn't have before. And were harder.
80, 85 or 86?
I think later than that. I don't think really people. Yeah, when did synthetic growth hormone come around? It was late 80s, early 90s. Was it 85? Okay.
Yeah. So that was when the FDA approved it. That doesn't mean people could get it.
Yeah. What was the one before Crescormin? What was it called? Crescormin?
Yeah. That was the one that was killing people.
Yeah, that's the people that were getting Creutzfeldt Jacobson, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the brain would rot out. Supposedly, the rumor was that's what Lyle Ozeda died from.
Oh, okay. And I know that it was one of those diseases that by the time it was diagnosed, it was too late. You were dead.
Yeah, that was the rumor that he was taking cadaver growth hormone. I don't know.
Mike Mentor and Casey Viator use it as well. It's at least what I've heard. I have no way to prove that.
Yeah, no. I mean, these are the rumors that we hear. So let's talk about how to use it in a cycle. I mean, what should it be stacked with?
Well, so first off, I would say most people, if they have very little experience with it, would start lower, right? I would say you should start with 2 or 3 units. And it takes a couple weeks. I would say hold it there for a couple weeks, right? And then you titrate it up. It doesn't need to go dramatically, 2 or 3, and then you can go to 4 or 5, depending on what your goal is, right? If your goal is muscle, we're talking about muscle gain specifically.
Yep.
So you want to be over 5, right?
Right.
If you're young and you have a somewhat functioning pituitary, you could probably get away with 5 or 6. And you're going to want to stack it with, I would say testosterone. I guess you could technically stack it with nandrolone if you're someone who's testosterone sensitive. And, obviously, I would minimize the trembolone use, even though we just did a video on that. It's not something I was necessarily advocating. I would think that, even a simple testosterone plus another anabolic plus growth hormone, or like a test primo GH would probably be super effective. And if you got the dose up to 6 IUs, 8 IUs, 10 IUs on the top end, I mean, what do you weigh? You're
270s right now.
I mean, and what do you think your upper limit is?
10 is where I'm running.
Okay. So that's what I'm saying. So unless someone's 300 pounds, I don't know if they need much more. You know, if it's assuming it's a legitimate growth hormone.
Yep. Well, 9 is what I'm running, really.
Yeah.
9.
So that's what I'm saying. So nine is plenty if it's good.
Yep.
I would think for fat loss, I would say the dose doesn't need to be as extreme. It's not to say there won't be fat loss effects at that same dose, because there are. But if fat loss is the only thing, you could probably get by with just 2 units a day.
I've heard in the pro bodybuilding circles, I've talked to many pro bodybuilders, but like sort of the bro logic rule of thumb is take as much as you can afford and tolerate.
I mean, again, if you're 300 pounds, perhaps, I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
Would be there's got to be an upper limit. At a certain point, you're just doing organ damage, I would think. Again,
yeah, I would think so too. Of course, you know, bodybuilders, they don't care about their organs.
I mean, we saw there was that study. There was only one study that I know of that was done on like healthy young exercising men. I want to say it was in Japan, and they used the equivalent. Those guys weren't super big, but like to equate the dose to like you or I, it would be the equivalent of running like 30 units of growth a day.
Yep.
And it was basically their IGF levels, which is how we generally measure this, were tapped out somewhere around 8 to 10. Right. So they weren't really experiencing anything more for that extra 20 units a day.
You know what's interesting? I noticed that my IGF-1 levels don't get really any higher past 6 units. It's the same at 9 as it was.
Yeah, that's okay.
But maybe 6 is the optimal.
It doesn't mean it's not doing anything. It just, that's at least with IGF in the blood. But again, that's just showing you what's in the blood.
I've also noticed that when people are in a caloric deficit on preps or diets, that the IGF-1 levels aren't high. So there's, and it could be estrogen suppression. It could be
low insulin, low
insulin. Yep.
I mean, one of the things that really going to affect IGF output are going to be energy, protein, and estrogen is definitely one. But I think if you're in a super low energy state, the body's not going to make a ton of IGF. It's kind of a survival mechanism, right? The same as our body's not going to build muscle in a deficit, because cavemen didn't need to be more muscular if there was no food. They don't need.
I know there's this bro logic of go test your IGF-1 levels to see if your HGH is good. And I've told people, like, that may not be a true indicator or a way to do it, because if you're in a state like that, your IGF-1 may be low and your HGH is good.
And you could also in theory, in theory, generic HGH should be the same as pharma GH, right? It all starts in the same factories.
It's all 191 AA, right?
It has to be, because it was 192 when it first came out, right? So it's
right.
191 or it's not. Assuming it's real and it's 191, where the difference really lies is in how it's handled after, right? So like,
right,
pharmaceutical stuff is handled in a spacesuit and it's shipped temperature controlled, and it's immediately put in cold storage and whatever, where the black market stuff is not necessarily handled the same way, so it could degrade, and then it might sit in a shipping container, from China to all the way here, so it could sit for months in a hot shipping container and degrade. But I've still seen it could still elevate, even if it's slightly damaged, it could still elevate your IGF-1. So that doesn't mean that's not necessarily a valid test for it. I don't think there's a way for the general public though to test the quality of HGH. They
do have these test kits you can pick up now. I don't know how accurate they are, though.
It'll test the purity of it.
Yeah. Well, it'll test whether it's a binary test. It'll either say it's HGH is present or not.
Oh, okay. Because they have that you can get those for steroids, but that just means that as long as something is present, right?
Right.
So you can use Primo and it'll say Primo's present. It doesn't mean it could be 1% Primo.
Right.
Right. It could be 99% masteron.
Yeah, these colorimetric tests.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. I mean, actual percent purity tests, I don't think available for like mass market.
No, not unless you send them off to a lab, which you can't do here in the US.
Yeah, I don't think you'd really want to send your steroids to a lab. Probably wonder why.
Well, I don't think you can in the US. It's illegal.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're going to question what you're doing. Serum IGF levels, they occur very quickly in the presence of growth hormone. So like if you inject, obviously you're injecting a bolus of it, IGF will peak 6 to 12 hours after injection, right? So the HGH is fully absorbed within 2 to 3, IGF will peak within 6 to 12. But the cool thing is after one injection, IGF levels will stay elevated for 8 days.
Oh, wow. So,
I mean, again, guys obsess about the dosing schedule. As far as IGF is concerned, even if you missed a couple of days, IGF is still going to be up there. That doesn't mean that that's an ideal way to use, right? So the only ways that I know that are like actual ways to use are every day or every other day, right? So every day is the standard, and every other day is for people that experience big side effects or for children with delayed growth, because that mimics more that mimics, it keeps the wave a little lower, so it mimics more natural growth wave in a child. And in HIV, every other day is what is switched. So if someone with HIV experiences side effects from the 6 milligrams of Serostim, the doctor's instructed to use it every other day instead of lowering the dose, because the dose is what's helping them.
Yeah, I've heard of bodybuilders doing that where they take it less frequently but keep the doses higher.
You could. I don't have any personal experience. I mean, that's used in the medical community. That's a valid way to use it there. I think the 5 days on, 2 days off was made up by bodybuilders.
Yeah, that was, I remember Dorian Yates talking about that. Well, the story was, I heard why guys did that. It's just because they couldn't afford to take it every day.
Makes sense, right? I mean, it was probably super expensive in the 90s.
Yeah. Oh, I remember the generic kits, crud, 2004, 2005. I remember I bought a generic kit one time and it was like $600 for a generic. Yeah, $500-600. It was something like that. Now you can get three or four kits for that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's funny. Yeah. So yeah, you'd probably want to only run 5 days.
Yeah, it was crazy expensive back then. And not, as far as I knew back then, no recreational bodybuilders were running it.
Yeah, it was like the way Masteron was like very hard to find too, right? Like
Masteron was impossible to find. Yeah. None of that stuff was around.
I mean, what I would say was hyper and hypothyroidism are both associated with suppressed HGH levels. So that's kind of an interesting point, that you really need your thyroid to kind of in the middle. You don't want it to swing either way because it'll affect that. I would say that the smartest way to use it is to use a stack combining anabolic steroids and growth hormone. Obviously, I'm not giving medical advice, but that would be the way that it would be used for performance. It's not going to do a whole lot. Short of some anti-aging stuff, growth hormone is not going to do a lot on its own.
There was some bro logic that you should take T4 with growth hormone, or T4 or T3.
I would say T4.
Or both.
I would say.
Yep.
I would say T4 because again, you're supplying the substrate. I think.
Yep. I'm
not a huge fan of T3. I think the problem is T3 is very catabolic and it's not selective. It'll destroy muscle.
Believe me, I know about that.
Really struggles with it. I've seen like really horrible effects from T3, unless it's used really like a mild dose. T3 should probably be avoided. And like medically, they're not really using T3 much anymore because they're not putting people on steroids anymore. So they're just going to waste all their muscle.
Yeah, I had a horrible experience.
T4 is okay to use.
I had a horrible experience with T3 on contest prep where I lost all my muscle. It was awful, man.
It's a good look, right? You spend all that time just to lose your muscle.
Yeah, I ended up at the end of it looking like I escaped from a prison camp. It was really bad. But yeah, I guess with T4 it's sort of self-regulating anyway.
Yeah,
the body's going to
convert to a certain extent, and
the body's going to make whatever T3 it needs from that.
Yep. I would say, I would use either, testosterone or nandrolone would be the two main ones that I would use with it to support that. Obviously, I would say testosterone first. You want to inject growth hormone and pulsatile factor to maximize, availability and usage of it, just the way the body's going to secrete it. 3 units or less per dose is usually ideal. And there is usually a ceiling, like we talked about before, for benefits versus risk. So for most people, the ceiling is about 4 to 8 IUs a day. After that, the side effects become more pronounced, right? And you're not necessarily getting more. Again, I can't speak to a guy that's 300 pounds solid muscle. That's not really a study thing, and normally
all the studies go out the window when you get to the extreme end.
Yeah, so it's not to say that Nick Walker can't get away with 18 units. I'm sure he can.
Right.
But for the average guy that's watching this video, that's 180 to 220 or whatever, I would say 4 to 8 is probably plenty, assuming it's real. If you have to use 12 or 15 to get a result, I would question the quality of the growth hormone.
I tell people, I know it's probably a cruddy analogy, but it's like trying to take what Nick Walker's take. It's also like trying to eat the same amount of calories he's eating. It's unnecessary for where you're at.
Unless you're Nick Walker, you don't need to do that. It's like
it's all relative.
Yeah. So that's pretty much where I would leave that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So, so to recap, testosterone, you want some estrogen conversion for IGF-1 conversion, from what I understand. So you don't want to bury your estrogen completely. And the old standby that you hear, like when you talk to pro bodybuilders, most pro bodybuilders that I talk to, people don't want to believe this, the off-season cycles typically test
750.
primobolan,
Yep.
HGH, and insulin. That's pretty much what most everybody runs. Or maybe equipoise instead of
randomly nandrolone, right?
nandrolone. Yeah, nandrolone's another one too. But I think
most is primo nowadays.
Primo, yeah. I think a lot of people have side effect issues with nandrolone. I know I have had some issues, but I do like nandrolone for growth. Nothing makes me grow better than nandrolone.
But it's not necessarily worth the side effects, depending, right?
Yeah, limp noodle and anxiety and things like that. So
mental stuff from it too. Yeah, I mean that's what I would say. If you couldn't grow on test primo, GH, and insulin, it's time to pick a different sport.
Yeah, and it's also a very safe combo too. Like you can, not that I'm suggesting that you should push doses high, but you can get pretty aggressive with that protocol and maintain relatively healthy blood markers.
Yeah, we can do one on we could do one on primo. I mean,
Primo would be a good one. People have asked about primo. All right, Kurt, I think that's a good place to wrap up, buddy. I appreciate you coming on again, guys. Thank you for watching. There will be the Growth Hormone ebook coming out. Kurt's working on getting his website up and running. It'll be there. Yeah, and I'll have it up on my website too for sale.
My website will probably be up by the time this video airs.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and if it is, I'll put the link in the video description so you guys can reach out to Kurt directly. Kurt also does coaching and consultations as well if you want to get a hold of him and check him out. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.